Hey everybody. Okay, I apologize in advance for the length of this. I hope it's not crazy long, and I'm also reading off my computer instead of notes because I decided I've killed a lot of trees, and then with the fire, we probably have killed more trees than any 1L class ever. So here we go. This is the last section that we did. This is everything from after the last midterm. So strict liability. Traditional strict liability, a jury doesn't need to find fault here. Only an action is enough, hence the strict. So the elements for this are activity giving rise to strict liability, cause and fact, proximate cause of the type of harm for which we subject the activity to strict liability, and damages. So there are three major categories for this. There's animals of certain types, and the first type is wild animals. And the reason for this is you can't control them and there's no ability to provide due care. Wild is defined as animals that cannot ordinarily be kept without danger. Can be variations of what is wild from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The minority rule is if animal is displayed for public use, extreme caution is the standard or super negligence. Domestic animals would be dog, cats, and farm animals as well. And people say the one bite rule, but that is not a real thing. So for the purposes of this exam, remember this one bite rule, not a real thing. Don't let it trip you up. If the animal is known dangerous or vicious or has that propensity, the courts will generally impose strict liability to the owner. Many states have dog bite statutes making it a strict liability, but that still doesn't mean one bite rule, so take that out of your vocabulary. Okay, and then another area is animal trespass. When damage to land from the animal, there's strict liability for damages, and this is generally not applied to cats and dogs, but your goat, it's going to be about your goat. All right, unnatural conditions of land, non-natural use of land. So for this, unnatural conditions or non-natural use, the majority rule is there is no natural use of land. There is something that would be of a nature that it would be dangerous if it escaped. So this is like if you build a reservoir or the levees in New Orleans. So if you are unnatural use of land should get your antenna up for this. So if something's built there, if something's not natural and we're talking about land, this should raise your antenna. And then we have abnormally dangerous activities. So these are results of that are extreme enough to label an abnormally dangerous activity. There's a high risk of harm, high gravity of harm, inability to eliminate risk through exercising due care, extent to which the activity is not a matter of common usage, inappropriateness of activity to a place where it is carried on, and to the extent of which the value to the community is outweighed by the dangerous attributes. If costs outweigh the wealth, there is strict liability. Profit from activity balances with cost of society. That is definitely what I'm talking to Professor Cupp about tomorrow. And if anyone has a hypo, you can put it in the comments because I don't have one here. All right. Unforeseen intervening actions in traditional strict liability with other proximate cause tests. Intervening natural events and acts of third persons that are not reasonably foreseeable relieve the defendant of liability. even in strict liability cases. So a levee may break, but if it's because of a flood, that's an act of God that made it burst. So we're not going to give strict liability there. The hypo for this is vicious dog. Oh, intervening cause. So not the natural one, but intervening cause. If there's a vicious dog and he runs toward a man and the man jumps in the car, but he slips and breaks his arm, is that reasonable? It is reasonably foreseeable to try to get away, so that guy's fine. Strict liability. But we had a case where there was really loud noise, and the minks, by a mink farm, and the minks started eating their young, and they'd said, you know, there is a duty to warn if the plaintiff is known, but is this a reasonably foreseeable plaintiff? And no. So, but they did say negligence is a backup argument for strict liability. So if you can't get strict liability, you can still try a cause of action for negligence. So an affirmative defenses for strict liability are comparative negligence. And, you know, there's some pushback on this because does allowing this defense make sense in strict liability? Most jurisdictions will say yes. And then another is the assumption of risk is an affirmative defense. And then in the few jurisdictions that still use contributory negligence, it is probably not a defense for traditional strict liability. Okay. Products liability. Products liability is not a tort claim, but title for several tort claims. You know what? I just realized we're not finishing. We'll do one more video because it'll be on defamation. I'm not going to try to do them all in one. I knew I was missing something. Okay. So the biggest claims for products liability have been cars, cigarettes, and asbestos. And you can have products liability for something that is a product. So what is a product? Cut wood, anything that's made. What is not a product? A real property. So a house, unless it's a mobile home, or sometimes prefabbed homes will be put in the category of products, but most homes are not. A tree that's not cut and made into anything, not a product. Most claims are only allowed if a personal injury results from the product. And sometimes it's called a contort because the liability claims have contract issues, but there's expected merchantability. It is expected to be able to use for its ordinary purpose. It's a great question. I don't know what that is. Okay. And then we have two tort claims under product liability. There's negligence and then there's strict liability. So in negligence, this is morally based, so it plays better to the jury. And we know these tort elements well. Duty, generally that's not hard to find. And with that duty, there is a breach. So for breach, you can have a manufacturing defect, a design defect, or a warnings defect. And each one you do a little bit different analysis. So in a manufacturing defect, you're going to do a routine negligence analysis. You're going to see if it was reasonably foreseeable. And this one is historically pro-plaintiff. And then you're going to work on the subsequent remedial measures rule, which is a rule of evidence. And it says, if there's an allegation of negligence or defect and the manufacturer does something to try to mitigate further damage to others, that cannot be used as proof of defect or allowed as evidence. And they say this because this is for public policy. We want to encourage manufacturers to fix and prevent future harm. So the hypo for this is someone got assaulted in a dark apartment hallway. Apartment manager then put up more lights. Some jurisdictions will not apply this rule to manufacturing claims. But so here's another hypo. There's a specific convertible with no roll bar. It keeps rolling, so the manufacturer adds a roll bar. For design defects, it's the whole product lines that it's the whole product line that is at stake. So we look at the redesign is bigger than one case. So manufacturers have an incentive to not have a ton of lawsuits to make these changes. So then there's a design defect as well, and this is under breach. So the design defect can breach the duty, and for that we use a risk utility test or a reasonable alternative design test, and we'll get more into those when we go talk about strict liability, because we're going to do it in both. And then we're going to have a warning. Then there's also a warnings defect. So design defect, warnings defect, manufacturing defect. And then the warnings defect is pretty much the same thing as the design, except instead of doing a risk utility analysis for the design, you're going to do it for the warning, and you're going to do that with a reasonably alternative warning analysis as well. So for a design, it's a RAD, and for a warning, it's a RAW. And then the other elements are cause and fact, proximate cause, damages. So you're going to basically run a negligence analysis like you would for the negligence tort claim. But strict liability in torts, and this is following Rule 402A. It's not about morality, and so that can make a jury uncomfortable. So for strict liability, you need, based on Rule 402A, you need a seller that engages in the business of selling such a product. So if it is a vacuum cleaner manufacturer and he sold his car to his neighbor, like that's not it. It's someone who engages in this type of sales. And then you need a defective condition that's unreasonably dangerous. So this is our second element, defect. So you need a seller of this type of thing, and you need a defective condition that's unreasonably dangerous. And for this, there is also manufacturing defect, design defect, warning defect. So the first is a manufacturing defect. Professor Cupp calls this the oops. And basically it's oops cases. One of these things is not like the other. Something that we made is not like other things that are made, and then there's people getting sick. So the hypo is fish oil pills that contain contaminants, weak metal used in a car that ends up cracking and people get hurt. So the test for this is when production differs from intended design, manufacture differs from intended design, or consumer expectation. So my dad worked for General Motors, and he said every time they had an issue with products liability, it was always in the design, and someone always knew about it early on before anyone really got hurt. So that's something to think about. But again, when production differs from intended design, that's the test. And we're going to look at the manufacturer and see if the manufacturing differed from the intended design and what the customer expectation was. Obviously, you know that if a car gets in an accident, things will happen, but maybe you don't think that if the car gets hit from behind, the wheels will fly off or something weird like that. Okay, so then we have strict liability design defect, and again, this part is under the element 2 for defective condition. So we already have a seller, and now our defective condition is the design, and that is the plaintiff claims manufacturer made a bad choice, so that they had alternatives that they could use, and the designer chose this one, and that is what happened. This is often coupled with a warning defect, and the term state of the art is used here. It's a term of art. And it says it's not an affirmative defense, but it goes to proving defect. And it's most commonly defined as a situation in which the manufacturer used the best technology, scientifically and economically feasible, at the time the product was manufactured or marketed. Most commonly defined as a situation in which the manufacturer used the best technology, scientifically and economically feasible, at the time the product was manufactured or marketed. So that means it was state of the art. That's what we're defining at this moment. And in other words, that's what I have written down. I should have just read that. In other words, there is no feasible better one out there. This is primarily a shield if a product is state of the art, but it's not a sword that always wins, even if the plaintiff can show the product was not state of the art. So it's just evidence, as a lot of our things are. So the hypo for this is the convertible with a roll bar. That is a hypo for the whole design defect, not for that state of the art. And then the test for the design defect is a risk utility test. We do this in every class, guys. Balance the risk with the utility. Simply balance risks and utilities of design chosen compared to a reasonable alternative design. So you run these together. Are you rad? That's what you remember. Are you rad? Risk utility against a reasonable alternative design. If risk utility and the mix is sufficiently more favorable to the reasonable alternative design, that the chosen design is negligent or defective, if in strict liability, then plaintiff has established a defect. Okay, so and this type of test is more expensive because you actually need someone who can do the design and give you a reasonable, because you can't just pull it out of thin air. It has to be reasonable. Then the other minority jurisdiction will also say that they impute knowledge of the risk. So if a risk was only found out because 1 million people had that car on the road and then they found out that the wheels were falling off, I mean, they have testing, but go with me on this. They will say, well, now that you know the risks, we're going to put that on you in the beginning. So this was a lot of asbestos claims where when they did find out it made people so sick, it was like so far down the line. And so they said, well, we're going to make it so that you have that knowledge from the start, even though they didn't, which I think is super unfair, but I guess they're just trying to make the plaintiff whole. So this imputed knowledge is also generally done with a RAD, and it's also called the Wade-Keaton test, which so now we have consumer expectation. This is borrowing from contract law. And is it more dangerous than a reasonable customer would expect? So you get to run that analysis. There is also alternative liability, and that is in California, but it is a minority, but this is what we have in California, and it's a 2 bites of the apple test. And it argues that both risk utility and consumer expectation. So if either prevail, the plaintiff will win. So they can come at it from 2 aspects. Consumer expectation only allowed when consumer expectation is clear. So the hypo for this is a ladder that breaks when you step on it. This is clearly not the customer's expectation. You need to be able to step on a ladder. So and then you would do a risk utility assessment with a reasonable alternative design for the ladder, and that should come. People make ladders fine all the time, so that shouldn't be too hard. And then you think consumer expectation says I should be able to step on this ladder, and you establish the liability. Risk utility establishes causation from defect when utilities outweigh risks. Okay, so other design issues. Inherently unsafe products, like whiskey, there is no strict liability. This specifically excludes cigarettes. Okay. I'm going to ask on that because I know it's excluded, but I don't know if it's excluded from not strict liability. I'm a little confused. I just lost my place. Okay, so applies only FDA, other design. Okay. So it can also include, okay, prescription products are another category. Comment K of Rule 402A, which I will explain. If prescription has adequate warning, there will be no design defect. This applies only to prescription products and drugs. And a product can be something like a pacemaker. The courts are split on whether negligence can be brought. And courts are split on whether this applies to all or just prescription products with high utility. So, cosmetic things and high risk. FDA approval gives a floor of safe, not a ceiling. It's kind of like what we talked in con law about Congress regulating things, and do they mean to give uniformity, or do they mean to make a minimum safety standard? And this is it, minimum safety standard. Protection for drugs against lawsuits and overprotection is a policy decision to try to make drugs cheaper. I don't think I need to know that. Anyway, keep going. Warning defect. Warning defects, read the fine print. Generally a question of fact. So, question of fact goes to the jury. Two types of defects. There are procedural, when the plaintiff says warnings are given but wasn't really communicated. This would be fine print, so no one, too small to read. Or this is, well, it should have been in red ink, because this is the most important thing. Like, if you take this on an empty stomach, you will die. That should be bigger, or red. So that is a procedural issue. And then there's substantive. I can never say that word. Ones that have substance. And this is the substance of the warning is not there. So hypo as a package says danger, but it says nothing more. Not helpful. Probably a warning defect. And these two create, these two create a catch-22, because too many warnings, if there's too many warnings on a package, no one's going to read them. And that makes them ineffective. But if it's, so substantive and procedural, you have too many warnings and no one will read them, so they are ineffective. But if it's procedural and substantive, that's the converse of what we just said. If there's one huge warning and no more room. So the labelers might have 42 things that they could warn about, but there's no room, so now they put 3. And you were suffering from the 6th and you didn't know about it, and now you're saying, well, it should have been on the warning label. So we have to solve this problem by asking, what is reasonable? What is reasonable? So maybe something should have warned but didn't. It didn't effectively give a warning, whether or how. If one learns of new risks, especially with things that go into the body, and do not warn pretty quickly after learning, a small minority will say absolute liability. So if you find out that you die if you don't eat something before taking the pill, small minority will say absolute liability that you didn't tell people. I think most would say that, but Go with me, it's a hypo. And I ain't being paid for this hypo. All right, so the test for this design defect is a risk utility, generally with a raw. And this is the majority. So raws are cheaper in the warning because experts are not needed, a poor person's approach. So they say this is the poor person's approach to products liability. A risk utility, you must balance the pros and cons of giving warnings with the alternatives if they do not warn. So not only if they're not on there, but if there's too many and you don't read them. Too many warnings, they say, dilutes the actual consumer warning. We all know how that is. Not the same thing, but think of a CVS receipt. Strict liability looks at how product warns versus negligence, which looks at how the seller warned. So on strict liability, you are looking at the product, and on negligence, you're looking at the seller. And then for another test, you have imputed knowledge of risk. So once again, like, what did you know what you know now, putting on when you knew then. And this is coupled with a risks utility analysis. And then again, we have consumer expectation. Was product more dangerous than a reasonable person would expect? Alternative liability does not work in warning cases, so you don't get 2 bites of the apple. So you can't argue you're not going to be able to argue consumer expectation and why am I not finding? Okay. You don't get 2 bites of the apple. If you don't know what that means, rewind this and figure it out, because I can't find things. It's late. I've done this a lot. Okay. Other warning. It's actually not late. It's 9:30. Give me a break. It's been a long day. Okay. Other warning issues. Learned intermediary defenses is the majority. Someone needs to study. That would be me. If an intermediary, doctor, pharmacist, warns the manufacturer doesn't have to provided the intermediary gets a good warning. So the hypo for this is getting morphine. Now that we have drug commercials, there might be a trend away from this defense because people know a lot more, and so they're more apt to say, no, I know, but they really don't know because a commercial is not saying everything. And when it does, you're getting thrown off by it talking about erectile dysfunction and dying and diarrhea, which is very lovely when you're just trying to watch This Is Us. All right, obviousness and warning. So the other warning issues, obviousness and warnings. This can be fatal to warnings claims, and a hypo is a knife is sharp. So like, duh, it's obvious. I shouldn't need to put big long warning on a knife that I'm selling because it's sharp, because I'm selling it because you need a sharp object. Okay, there's also causation in warning. If warning were given, it is assumed it would have been followed. Defendant can bring evidence to rebut this. Let's think about Tide Pod videos. And then otherwise, courts presume given warnings are heeded. That's what I said, right? And then there's also warning pollution, and that's a substantive defense. And it's like there's too much to communicate. And when the warning looks like a novel or a CVS receipt, no one is going to read that. So there's balance. So that is how you test for the defects. And let me just run through the elements again, because that was part of the defect. So for the elements, you're looking for a seller, the defect, and and then it's all the way down here because the defect, that was all in defect. And then no substantial change in condition in which sold, cannot personally change product in a material relevant way. And then you're looking for causation, proximate cause and cause in fact, and damages. I'm going to ask about the third element because I'm a little confused, so stay tuned. Or I don't know if I'm going to be able to have time for this, so ask me if I don't post an update. Or come to office hours and ask Professor Cupp. Or go, I know what she's talking about and she's an idiot, because that could be true too. All right, so there's affirmative defenses for products liability, and one is comparative liability. And the case that we looked at was the car door opened and the driver flew out, but he was drunk and he was not wearing a seatbelt and he was speeding and he died. But it was also the 70s, and like seriously, like people didn't wear seatbelts back then. So it was totally reasonably foreseeable, not like it would be today, and the damn doors should not open. This is my soapbox, man. Like I know multiples of people who fell out of car doors before the 1980s, and it's ridiculous. Anyway, so, sorry, soapbox. For strict liability, affirmative defenses, the majority, in strict liability, the majority lets a comparative liability claim be used, and a significant minority, though, will not allow comparative liability in strict liability. For negligence, there are 3 approaches, and so they use comparative liability like they use comparative negligence, and our 3 approaches are pure, greater than, or not less than. So remember that in a greater than district, so in pure, they're gonna just say like what was your percentage of the blame? And in a greater than, you have to be you have to be 50, someone said 50 and a feather the other day, but you have to be more than 50%, because if you're 50-50, you lose in a greater than district. But in a not less than, you could be 50% because you could be less than or equal to, no, greater than or equal to. So 50-50 will win in a not less than jurisdiction. In a greater than, 50-50 will lose. In a pure, 50-50 means the damages are going to be, you're only going to be able to collect 50% of the damages. And then for contributory negligence, that's a very, very few jurisdictions, and it's not allowed in strict liability. So actually that was, I go through so many pens. Okay. So no contributory negligence in strict liability, and for negligence, there are also the 3 approaches: the pure, greater than, not less than. And then another affirmative defense is the assumption of risk. Negligence, for a negligence claim, this is the same as other negligence formulas. And for strict liability, product manufacturers are not going to be able to pull off express assumption. But implied might be applicable. So you're going to look at, did the subject have an appreciation of the risk? Did they voluntarily encounter the risk? Hypo for this is cigarettes, and California and others comparative assumption of risk is not a nuclear defense. So comparative assumption of risk, not a nuclear defense. Okay. And then another affirmative defense is misuse. Jurisdictions are split if this is an affirmative defense. The defendant has the burden to prove, and jurisdictions are split if this is an affirmative defense or just part of the prima facie elements, which would mean that the plaintiff has the burden. Okay. I'm a little confused at that too. That's why I'm doing this. I hope you're as confused as I am and you come to office hours. Okay, so the case, we have the man starting a tractor while standing next to it. It wasn't supposed to be able to be started if it was in gear. So the rule is misuse a reasonably if misuse is reasonably foreseeable, then they don't count it as misuse. Okay, so let me try to work this out. If you have the plaintiff, who was the man who started the tractor while he was standing next to it, and it wasn't supposed to be able to start if you weren't in gear, but it did. So the man is the plaintiff. And so his claim is probably that it was a design defect and a warning defect. And so that is part of his prima facie elements, is what this defect was. And so that's his burden. And then the defendant, who is a tractor manufacturer, the defendant is going to use the affirmative defense of misuse, and it's on the defendant to show that him starting the tractor while standing next to it was misuse. And then to do that, they're going to see if the misuse was reasonably foreseeable, and if it was, then they're going to say they're going to kill the defense. They aren't really going to kill the defense. They're going to kill the affirmative defense. The hypo for this was if you were to carve a right and a left letter into your contacts and then you put them in your eyes and you said, oh, like that type of misuse is not reasonably foreseeable. But that's crazy. I don't know why. That was a hypo. I need to ask for that hypo again because I don't get it. I thought I did. Maybe I did before I wrote this. Anyway, we'll ask. When children misuse a product, it is usually considered foreseeable. Sitting on the vacuum case. Intentional misuse is not reasonable. Is intentional misuse not reasonably foreseeable and squashes liability? Often, when misuse is repugnant to the not conscious. Okay. Anyway, the hypo for this is the man throws a glass bottle at a pool. It shatters and cuts him. He sues that the glass should have been thicker. And they're going to say, no liability. Crazy. And then there's also preemption. Look at us crossing wires. Preemption, just like in con. And this is express, and that's when Congress expressly has complete control. So this includes like the labels on cigarettes. This stated complete control means states cannot add or take away from this. And then there is implied preemption by Congress. And this says Congress has not explicitly stated its exclusive control, but the control is so all-inclusive it is implied that they are. This is like airbags, that there was a comprehensive timeline given by Congress, even though it was never said outright, it was exclusive. And then prescriptions, FDA approval is a floor, not a ceiling. So for now, it is not all-inclusive. And then, so we're out of our, okay. And then we also have, we're going to talk about other defendants in product liability cases. A seller is someone who regularly engages in the sale of a specific product. The plaintiff can sue anyone in a chain responsible for the product. So in the case of asbestos, most manufacturers were bankrupt. So injured, they had to go to the sellers down the chain because they weren't going to get anything from bankrupt defendants. The plaintiff can also be someone injured. It doesn't have to just be the buyer in strict liability. And the hypo for this can be if your wheel falls off your car and it hits a pedestrian, the pedestrian can sue. Possible people in the chain are principal manufacturer, retailers and wholesalers, real property sellers, builders. There's no strict liability for builders. But, you know, as we said, mobile homes, possibly yes, strict liability. Prefab mass-made homes, maybe. And this is the hypo with the shower door that was supposed to be like a plastic or a tempered glass, and it was not, and it shattered. But because it was so pervasive in all of these homes, and it was just like what they did, and it shouldn't have been that they were able to put it forward with product liability. Used products sellers. So they are liable unless they sell something as is. Jurisdictions are split on whether they allow this. Used sales are not in the direct chain, so they don't get indemnity from those higher up in the chain that they could then sue. So it's kind of like when we run deed title warranties, and you can like go back, and then if someone gets you for something, you can go back and get someone earlier in the chain, indemnity. And then any jurisdiction that allows this is going to be hard to win a claim based on defect, because they weren't the manufacturer. So it's hard to do your design or warning or anything like that, because it generally doesn't come from them. And then we have service providers, and these are teachers, lawyers, doctors, accountants. Are they strictly liable for defective advice? No, they are not. Although there are hybrid transaction cases, and in something like that, you have to look at the essence of the job. So like a pacemaker put in by a surgeon, the essence is the surgical service. So no, he's not going to be strictly liable for the product of the pacemaker. But they say that in a hair salon with a hair perm, the essence is the product, not the service. So there could be strict liability, products liability there. The more specialized the skill, the less likely a claim of strict liability will prevail. And then we have innovators, and this is the liability for generic drug manufacturer. Lower people in the chain can get indemnity from people higher in the chain, which we talked about. And that is products liability and strict liability.